Good evening, everyone. My name is Zoe Marks, and I'm on the faculty here at the Harvard Kennedy School. And I'm here on behalf of the Dean, Doug Elmendorf, who is currently testifying in Congress in DC, but very much wishes he could be here with us. We're honored tonight to be joined by Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, a distinguished economist and chair of the board of Gavi. She will be presenting this year's Robert McNamara Lecture on War and Peace, entitled The Changing Face of Poverty: Can Africa Surprise the World? Before I introduce our speaker, I want to say a few words about this esteemed lecture. As many of you know, Robert McNamara served as the US Secretary of Defense for President Kennedy and President Johnson, and then served for 13 years as president of the World Bank. There were many profoundly difficult challenges he faced related to national and global security and poverty reduction. But there are three legacies in particular that I want to mention that highlight the ethos of this school and the purpose of the McNamara Lecture. First, as Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara was an advocate for social equity. He issued an equal opportunity directive that required US military officers to end discriminatory practices in their units as well as in nearby communities by leveraging the economic power of the military. He also, as World Bank president, shifted the focus of the bank towards poverty reduction, a legacy that continues to this day, and he championed causes such as education, health, and food security. Finally, Robert McNamara did one of the most difficult feats for public leaders. He reflected honestly and poignantly on his changing views and his own self-assessed mistakes. He crossed party lines during his life, and he took moral stands in support of peace. Therefore, the purpose of tonight's McNamara Lecture is to explore the ways to resolve some of our greatest challenges peacefully and in pursuit of global equality. We at the Kennedy School are grateful to be joined by members of the McNamara family and the Pastor family for their continued support of this opportunity. Thank you for joining us tonight. Now it is my great privilege and joy to introduce our speaker. Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala brings more than 30 years of development and financial expertise. She served twice as Nigeria's finance minister, most recently between 2011 and 2015, with the expanded portfolio of coordinating minister for the entire economy. In 2006, she also served as Nigeria's Minister of Foreign Affairs, and she has held several key positions at the World Bank, including managing director. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala's experience and expertise as a former finance minister are particularly valuable in her leadership as chair of the board of Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance, which strives to ensure that immunization programs are financially sustainable. She is strongly committed to finding private sector solutions to development challenges, and this is a perspective that she brings to her roles on the boards of the Rockefeller Foundation and the Center for Global Development, among others. She is also chair of African Risk Capacity, a specialized agency of the African Union that helps member states prepare for and respond to extreme weather events and natural disasters. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala has been recognized by Time magazine as one of the world's 100 most influential people, by Fortune magazine as one of the 50 greatest world leaders, and by Forbes for 5 consecutive years as one of the 100 most powerful women in the world. Dr. Okonjo-Iweala graduated from this fine institution with an A.B. magna cum laude in economics, and she holds a PhD in regional economics and development from our neighbors down the river at MIT. She's the author of several books and has been recognized with numerous honorary doctorates, including from Yale University, Brown University, and the University of Pennsylvania. Please join me in welcoming our guest, Harvard's own Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala.
Well, thank you very much, Zoe, for that fine introduction. It's always a trial for me listening to introductions of myself because, of course, they always don't seem real, but thank you anyway. It's very much a pleasure and an honor to be back here at Harvard. It's always a wonderful thing, and to be here at this wonderful building of the Kennedy School. It's an honor to have been invited to follow in the paths of distinguished lecturers to give this McNamara Lecture, a truly great man. He left the bank the year before I joined. However, I was privileged to meet him twice when he asked for some special briefings on issues. I was quite junior then, but I was taken along by those who were going, and I was privileged to meet him. And so it means a lot to me that Margaret McNamara Pastor, Bruce and Joyce Pastor, members of the family are here today. Thank you very much. Well, today I've decided that this being close to half a century since Robert McNamara's seminal lecture, which refocused the development agenda by offering a new definition of absolute poverty, and Zoe referred to this, I felt it appropriate to take this opportunity to return to this important and ever-challenging subject. Because, as Martin Luther King said, and I quote, "Whatever affects one directly affects us all indirectly. As long as there's poverty in this world, no man can be totally rich, even if he has $1 billion. As long as diseases are rampant and millions of people can not expect to live more than 20 or 30 years, no man can be totally healthy, even if he just got a clean bill of health from the finest clinic in America." All this is simply to say that all life is interrelated. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. That's Martin Luther King. So I want to talk today about the changing face of poverty. Can Africa surprise the world? And I think it's really opportune to be reflecting on this subject at this time, in light of yesterday's news, when we heard that Abhijit Banerjee, Esther Duflo, and Michael Kramer of Harvard here won the Nobel Prize in Economics for their work on poverty. So poverty is still at the center of intellectual work and thinking in the world. And I was thrilled, whether you agree with randomized trials or not, their methodology or not, it is still fantastic that they won the prize. I know that many of you here are experts on this issue of poverty, and so maybe I'll be preaching to the converted, as they say. But I do hope I can bring some fresh perspectives based on the fact that I've seen poverty from all sides, and I've seen hope and progress. I've seen poverty from my childhood in the village of Obofu Ogwashuku in Delta State, Nigeria, living with my grandmother till the age of 9, fetching water from a stream a couple of miles away, fetching firewood from the forest, and going with my widowed grandmother to the farm every weekend and school holidays. I've also seen poverty, hunger, and malnutrition up close during my early teens, from 1967 to 1970, when we lived through 3 years of the Nigeria-Biafra War. I know what it means to go hungry with 1 or no meals a day. I know what it means to see children dying of kwashiorkor and malaria day in, day out. And as an adult with a long career at the World Bank, I've seen poverty around the globe, from the small child smoking a cigarette to ward off hunger in the hills of Laos, to a little girl dying from malnutrition in a rural hospital in India. And I've seen poverty from a macro and micro perspective as a 2-time finance minister, the longest-serving finance minister of Nigeria, and Minister of Foreign Affairs in my own country. But most importantly, amidst this poverty, I've also seen hope. The light and excitement in the eyes of poor girls and boys, poor men and women, when they see the opportunity to change their lives and break out of their daily grind. And so I do hope that I may be able to offer some important perspectives on this subject, particularly as it concerns Africa, a continent where people's perception of no hope is often overwhelming. Picking up where Bob McNamara left off, my focus today is on the changing face of poverty globally and in Africa and what we can do about it. The numbers tell us that that face is increasingly likely to be African. And rather than being that of the weather-beaten and weary face of a subsistence farmer, which we have long associated with poverty and which McNamara talked about, today what I see more often in my village, in the towns of Nigeria and all over Africa, is the face of an unemployed or underemployed rural or urban youth. But what I also see in that face is youthful energy and the opportunity to harness that energy productively to create jobs and create wealth, not just for that youth, but also for his or her peers. But let me talk first about what you might call the old face of poverty and how that has changed from the 70s till now, and then turn more specifically to Africa to examine what poverty looks like today, but also what could be done about it. The old face of poverty. In 1973, Robert McNamara gave his now famous address to the Board of Governors of the World Bank in Nairobi, where he coined the term absolute poverty, a term that has now come to define the way we measure progress and track the welfare of those at the bottom of the ladder. He said, quote, "Despite decades of unprecedented increase in the gross national product of the developing countries, the poorest segments of their population have received relatively little benefit. Nearly 800 million individuals, 40% out of a total of 2 billion, survive on incomes estimated in US purchasing power at 30 cents per day, in conditions of malnutrition, illiteracy, and squalor. They are suffering poverty in the absolute sense." At that time, all regions, East and South Asia, Africa, Latin America, were struggling with the same problems. How to grow their economies equitably, how to tackle hunger and malnutrition, increase life expectancy, improve maternal and infant mortality, and increase literacy rates. The face of poverty was pretty representative of the developing world, and in that sense, pretty universal. It was Chinese, Indonesian, Thai, Indian, Latino, and African. It was the face of that tired rural female or male farmer, and in fact, in terms of numbers, Africa represented just 10% of the absolute poor. More than 2 decades later, in 1997, Jim Wolfensohn, then president of the World Bank, gave another famous speech on poverty, again to the World Bank's Board of Governors on the occasion of the annual meetings in Hong Kong, and he called it the challenge of inclusion. In the 2 decades since McNamara, there had been considerable progress. The proportion of people living in absolute poverty had fallen from 40 to 29%, though the number of those living below the then absolute poverty line of $1 a day had grown to 1.3 billion due to population growth. Life expectancy had increased from 60 to 67 years, literacy rates had improved from 77% to 85%, and maternal and under 5 mortality had improved. Maternal mortality had declined to 353 per 100,000 live births, and under 5 mortality had declined to 83 per 1,000 live births. Much of that success was due to tremendous progress in East Asia, especially China. As Jim Wolfensohn put it in his speech, quote, "China's success has been truly remarkable. Less than a generation ago, 8 in 10 Chinese eked out an existence by tilling the soil for less than $1 a day. 1 adult in 3 could neither read nor write. Since then, 200 million people have been lifted out of absolute poverty, and illiteracy has fallen to less than 1 in 10. The face of poverty was changing to be less Chinese, less East Asian, and more South Asian and African. But the essence of poverty was troubling. Whilst overall there was progress, some regions and some segments of the population were not progressing as fast as others, and so were being left behind. This is what Jim Wolfensohn saw as the challenge of inclusion, or put the other way, the tragedy of exclusion. Now, the new face of poverty. Fast forward to 2019, coincidentally another 2 decades later, and the world has made even more progress. The proportion of people living under the absolute poverty line, now $1.90 a day, has fallen to less than 8% of the world's population of 570 million people. Life expectancy has improved to 72 years, literacy rates up slightly to 86, and maternal and under 5 mortality have declined to 211 per 100,000 live births and 38 per 1,000 live births respectively. But the face of poverty has shifted even more. Poor people, now located not just in low-income but also in middle-income countries, are primarily concentrated in Africa, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa. Of these 570 million people in absolute poverty, 453 million or 79% are in Africa. 35 million or 6% in South Asia, 30 million or 5% in East Asia, and another 30 million in Latin America, with the remaining 5% distributed to the rest of the world. In fact, projections show that at the current slow rate of poverty reduction, close to 90% of the world's poor will be in Africa by 2030, a far cry from the zero target in the Sustainable Development Goals. This phenomenon is sharply illustrated by maps and charts put together by the Brookings Institution Poverty Clock Project. And I have the projections. If you can just show 1973 first. So that's 1973, and the darker red portions are where most of the poor people are. So you can see what I was saying. Go back. What the face of poverty looked like. It was all over the world, and it was concentrated even in East Asia. Now go to 1997. You see what has happened. Lighter lines in Asia, more reds in Africa. Go to 2019. Look at what we have now. Asia, the poverty face has shifted primarily to Africa. So that's what I talk about. If you like the issue of the shifting faces or the color, whichever kind of description you like, you can see how the thing has changed. So Brookings Poverty Clock Project, I love it because it shows you graphically how this is changing. And using today's absolute poverty line of $1.90 a day to enable comparisons, they have calculated the headcount ratio, the measure number of those in absolute poverty. In 1973, using their measure, 1997 and 2019, to be 1.9 billion people in absolute poverty in 1973, 1.7 in 1997, with a dramatic fall to 570 million today in 2019. And this concentration shows you the issue as being an issue that is now primarily African, and an issue that is now primarily that of youth in the ages of 15 to 35. So what happened in Africa? Africa made some progress over the years, just like the rest of the world. But the progress has not been fast enough. That's the problem. The proportion of people in absolute poverty did fall from 58% in 1997 to 41% in 2019. But the absolute numbers of poor people have increased from 353 million to 453 million in the same period due to population growth. Only a handful of countries in Africa have gone through the demographic transition, so fertility rates are still high in most countries. Literacy rates have improved from 56% in 1997 to 64% now. So has life expectancy from 50 to 61 years now. Maternal mortality has improved to 534 per 100,000 live births, and also has under 5 mortality improved. But these rates are still far behind those of the rest of the world, as we saw earlier, and even further behind what will be needed to attain the Sustainable Development Goals, the world's new universal goals. For example, maternal mortality at 534 per 100,000 live births is 2.5 times the world average, and almost 8 times the SDG goal of less than 70 per 100,000 live births by 2030. So with respect to most indicators of welfare, Africa is not converging fast enough. It's improving, but it's not converging fast enough with the rest of the world. In the 2 decades since 1997, South Asia has clearly pulled away on the absolute poverty story, leaving Africa, and in particular sub-Saharan Africa, at the center of this story. People are interested in what accounts for this. And this is, of course, an important question, which I shall come back to in a moment. But a more interesting question to me is, what accounts for the progress that was made? However inadequate that has been. And can it point the way out of Africa's poverty problem. First, on the causes of poverty, they are what I term the familiar causes in Africa. I already mentioned the issue of demography and a delayed demographic transition on the continent. This is a very delicate subject that you will not hear many African policymakers discuss. And if you want to approach it, you have to approach it by talking about strengthening girls' education. With fertility rates still quite high at 4.7 births per woman, population growth rates are high, averaging 2.7 almost in 2019, so that per capita GDP growth rates are not high enough to lift people fast enough out of poverty. There's also gender inequality. The lack of access by women to the services and means of production, including finance, needed to improve their lives and that of their households is a significant factor. Agricultural productivity in sub-Saharan Africa is approximately 1/3 that in East Asia and Latin America. The abundance of natural resources, its mismanagement, and the lack of transparency and accountability lack of accountability it has oftentimes engendered is another factor. And above all, the lack of human and physical infrastructure. Access to basic health, access to education, particularly quality education and skills relevant to today's economy and society, access to power, roads, ports, and telecommunications. Now, another key cause of poverty, a fundamental one, is put forward by a school of thought that argues that Africa's poverty is due to a lack of progress on industrialization and Africa's inability to undergo the model of structural transformation experienced by the East Asian countries and China. This model was based on large-scale industrialization and export-led growth, in turn premised on education, skills, and a competitive labor force. In fact, Africa's share of manufacturing as a percent of GDP has stagnated around 10%, and the share of workers employed in manufacturing has peaked below that level. This phenomenon has been termed premature deindustrialization by African scholars such as Lopez and Coulibaly. According to Coulibaly, its causes could be, quote, the role of technological innovations in making manufacturing more capital and less labor intensive, as well as the impact of globalization and competition. As a result, labor moves from low productivity agriculture to low productivity services, bypassing the industrial sector. Furthermore, there's mounting pessimism about the likelihood of Africa being able to replicate the East Asian model. According to Joe Stiglitz, the reason the East Asian model cannot be replicated is that manufacturing is the victim of its own success. Developments in the sector have done so much to improve productivity in terms of output per man-hour that productivity has increased faster than demand. The result is that employment in manufacturing is now declining around the world, which means it can no longer support large-scale employment creation. Now, added to these familiar and fundamental causes of poverty on the continent are issues of conflict and fragility, terrorism, climate change, and pandemics. Although the number of conflicts on the continent has decreased, there are still significant areas of fragility and conflict in Burundi, DRC, CAR, Central African Republic, South Sudan, and the Horn of Africa. In addition, new forms of conflict have emerged in the form of terrorism in Libya, Mali, northern Nigeria, and my own country, and Somalia. Climate change is accelerating the frequency and impact of certain weather-based phenomena, such as droughts, now so frequent in southern Africa and the Sahel. And of course, cyclones and floods, such as we saw recently with Cyclone Idai in Mozambique, Malawi, and Zimbabwe, where close to $1 billion in damage was caused and 600,000 people displaced. Pandemics are also now added to the mix. We saw the 2014 Ebola pandemic in West Africa cost $2 billion in GDP losses in Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone, while the recent outbreak in DRC has already led to more than 1,000 lives lost. The combination of new and old causes of poverty is leading to displacement, migration to cities, and migration outside the continent, largely to Europe. Young people are increasingly willing to risk their lives in the Sahara Desert or the Mediterranean to seek a better future. So what are the solutions? And how can Africa surprise the world? Africa offers the seeds to halt the increasing numbers of poor people, to reverse the tide and change the face of poverty permanently. This brings me to the point I made earlier, that what interests me more in the Africa poverty story is seeking to understand what was behind the progress that was made. Yes, it was inadequate, but there was progress. What is the fresh progress we made now? And what are the promising approaches for the future so that we can build on these to change the Africa story? It is possible for the poverty map to show Africa in lighter colors like the rest of the world 3 decades from now, by 2050. And of course, you young people in the audience, you'll be here by 2050. I'll be long gone. So you'll be the ones to testify whether what I'm saying has happened. And I'll check from the grave. If we understand the successes and build on them, that's my thesis, and we're willing to tackle the difficult changes, Africa can and will surprise the world. First, Africa grew for 1.5 decades from 2000 to 2015 at 4 to 6% per annum, higher than the average global growth rates of about 3.1%. While part of this growth was due to favorable global demands for its primary products, particularly from China, a large part of the growth was due to good macroeconomic management. Sensible fiscal policies that held fiscal deficits down, prudent debt management strategies following the internationally supported HIPC initiative that brought sub-Saharan African debt burdens down, monetary and exchange rate policies that led to single-digit inflation and largely market-determined exchange rates. African policymakers created the right macroeconomic environment for investment during these years and for real sector growth. And this enabled them to weather the headwinds and the storms of the Great Recession of 2008 to 2009 better than expected. Today, 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa: Senegal, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, and Tanzania, with GDP growth rates ranging from 6.6 to 8.3% per annum, the range of growth rates that Africa needs if it is to pull people out of poverty and meet the Sustainable Development Goals. These countries are implementing sensible macroeconomic policies that are encouraging to the private sector, and we need to encourage other countries to follow suit. We need to focus on 3 countries: Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola, that account for 53% of sub-Saharan Africa's GDP, and a 4th country, DRC, which along with Nigeria drives sub-Saharan Africa poverty headcounts. For all the good progress we may see in other countries, if these 4 countries do not improve their performance, socioeconomic indicators for the continent will continue to lag. All countries need to save more and invest more as a percent of their national income. Policymakers must focus on improving domestic resource mobilization because much of the investment needed to lift people out of poverty must come from our own domestic, private, and public resources, not from outside. Africa has to lift tax to GDP ratios higher from an average of 18.2% in 2016. The IMF estimates that there's room for a 4 percentage point increase in tax to GDP ratios in most SSA countries that could move them closer to the best performers in the region, like Senegal and South Africa, that have ratios of 22 and 28% respectively. Countries must focus on prudent debt management, including transparent accounting for both domestic and external debt. The increase in the SSA debt to GDP ratio from 25% in 2007, following HIPC, to 49% in 2018 is worrying if borrowing is not productively used. When I focus on prudent debt management, I do not mean that countries that have the fiscal space should not borrow. In these times of low interest rates in the capital markets, countries that have the fiscal space can borrow internationally to finance productive physical and human infrastructure. It is just that many countries that can ill afford it are plunging into the capital markets and borrowing, and they are not using it well. They need to be more careful. Second, African policymakers are more successfully combining macroeconomic reforms with micro and sectoral level reforms. There is an interesting realization that it's not enough to grow, but growth has to be inclusive, job-creating growth, aimed at putting the millions of young people entering the job market to work and improving their health, nutrition, education, and welfare. To attract the private sector, especially the millions of small and medium enterprise entrepreneurs on the continent to invest and create jobs, policymakers have embarked on business-related reforms. In a recent project syndicate opinion piece called The High Growth Promise of an Integrated Africa, Landry Senior and Amina Guri Fakim note, and I quote, "Political leaders are implementing reforms aimed at improving business conditions. In the World Bank's 2019 Doing Business Index, 5 of the 10 most improved countries are in Africa, and 1/3 of all recorded reforms occurred in sub-Saharan Africa. Already, returns on investment and entrepreneurship are rising fast. Over 400 African companies now boast annual revenues of $1 billion or more, and 700 more report revenues of over $500 million. An assessment of 360 companies from 32 African countries reveals an impressive average compound annual growth rate of 46% in 2019, up from 16% last year. These impressive numbers from a McKinsey study on Africa called Lions on the Move concern companies in an array of sectors: food and agri-processing, wholesale and retail, financial services, light manufacturing, and construction, for example, where the study highlights important investment and job-creating opportunities to service growing household and business consumption. Household consumption reached an estimated $1.4 trillion in 2015 and is projected to grow to $2.1 trillion per annum by 2025. The growing business-to-business market, companies selling to each other, reached $2.5 trillion in 2015, $2.5 trillion, and is projected to reach $3.5 trillion by 2025. Third, Africa is the world's fastest urbanizing region. Again, according to this McKinsey study, between 2015 and 2045, an average of 24 million additional people per annum will be added to Africa's cities, compared to 11 million in India and 9 million in China. Urbanization, properly managed, is strongly correlated with higher productivity and higher GDP growth. Africa's Achilles heel is its poor infrastructure and low human capital indicators. But urbanization permits agglomeration economies, often making it easier and cheaper to provide such services as electricity, transport, health, education, financial services that are lacking in rural areas. Better management of urbanization can unlock Africa's slums, enabling job creation vital to the youth who make up the largest category of the urbanizing population. Fourth, some scholars, in observing the success in combining macro, micro, sectoral, and spatial level reforms in several countries to spur growth, have noted that horticulture, tourism, creative industries, ICT, financial services are some of the fastest growing sectors in leading growth countries on the continent. A major research effort by the Brookings Institution's Africa Growth Initiative and the United Nations University World Institute for Development Economics Research looks at what it terms industries without smokestacks, and wonders whether, based on the patterns seen in these service sectors, Africa might be undergoing a different type of structural transformation than what we normally think of. The research has underscored that services exports from Africa grew more than 6 times faster than merchandise exports between 1998 to 2015. Ethiopia, Ghana, Kenya, and Senegal have become players in the global horticulture value chain. Rwanda, Senegal, and South Africa have significant footholds in ICT, while tourism is now 30% of Rwanda's total exports. In a piece by Coulibaly on Africa's alternative path to development, he points out that John Page, one of the researchers and editors of the forthcoming Industries Without Smokestacks, posits that these same growing service sectors share the same characteristics as the manufacturing export-led growth in East Asia. They are tradable, they have higher productivity, and can absorb large numbers of moderately skilled workers. And they benefit from technological change and economies of scale and agglomeration. The thinking is this, that if African policymakers can encourage and support these smokestackless industries, what a mouthful, they might offer a pathway out of premature deindustrialization and enable Africa to transform and to surprise by creating jobs, creating wealth, and eradicating poverty faster than expected. Fifth, technology. I mentioned ICT earlier, but I want to dwell just a little bit more on the issue of technology and its potential role. Africa is transforming in an era of rapidly changing technology, and so can leapfrog and solve many of its development challenges through digitalization. Technology can be a powerful tool for poverty eradication. New diagnostic techniques such as the spatial targeting of poverty hotspots developed by Brookings allows more granular identification than before of where poor people live at community and district level, whether in urban or rural areas, so that better tailored interventions and services can be delivered to them, improving poverty eradication outcomes. Biometrics gives people identities, making it easier to identify and target poor people, especially women and children, with services. This, to me, is very interesting because it mirrors the kind of microeconomic work done by Banerjee, DeFlo, and Kramer to study problems and solutions for poverty from the vantage point of targeting and seeing what works at the ground level for poor people. African governments and citizens are embracing new technology in a way that promotes inclusion. This is made possible by the ubiquitousness of mobile phones. There are now 750 million mobile phones in a population of 1.2 billion on the continent. Their availability makes it possible to deliver a range of services from financial to health and education. The best known is, of course, the mobile money in Kenya, M-Pesa, which, by the way, has spread to the rest of East Africa, and I saw it being used in India by the Self-Employed Women's Network for their work. I was thrilled. And I think Africa doesn't, and Kenya in particular, does not get the recognition it deserves for developing a technology. I'm sure if it was done in Silicon Valley, we wouldn't hear the last of it. Similar services are spreading over the rest of Africa, such as Stella in Nigeria, bringing access to micropayments, remittances, and other financial services to those previously excluded. This enables them to pursue the development of medium and micro enterprises. Gavi, the Vaccine Alliance of which I'm board chair, has supported Rwanda to pioneer a drone delivery service for vaccines, blood, and other supplies in partnership with Zipline, UPS, and 2 American companies. How many people have heard of this? Good. Very good. I'm very proud of it. You know, this is enabling and we have to give President Kagame and Rwanda credit, not Gavi. They are the ones. He's the one who approached us in Gavi to say, look, I've got a very mountainous country. I can't get roads everywhere. But there are people at the top of these mountains who need vaccines. They need medicines. Can you think of anything to help? And we had been talking to Zipline, this company in California. And so we were able to do this partnership, and I'm so proud of it, because it's enabling this government to reach people who are hard to reach. It's also enabling Ghana, which has adopted the same approach, to set up an extensive network that reaches 2,000 health centers and serves a population of 12 million people. In education, there are also many examples. There's EdTech applications, including the one in Malawi, 1 billion course, a software application that teaches reading, writing, and mathematics to grades 1 to 3. And in her excellent article on a digital Africa, Vera Songwe cites the potential for a digital economy to open up service sectors from business outsourcing to trade. According to her, there are already more than 22,000 people employed in business outsourcing services across the continent in Nigeria, Ghana, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Burkina Faso, Chad, and Niger, and Mauritius. And with respect to trade, she says, the advent of the newly ratified African Continental Free Trade Area will offer a framework for developing technology standards, harmonization, and interoperability to support cross-border commerce. Digital technology will play a dual role in turbocharging the free trade area. It will spur cross-border trade by speeding implementation, automating processes, and reducing costs. New areas of digital commerce and services will open up, including unlocking the supply chain logistics nightmare in many parts of Africa. Mobile devices, broadband networks, cloud services, the Internet of Things, and big data analytics could significantly lower the cost of planning, scheduling, tracking, delivering, and managing goods, opening up a massive opportunity to create jobs on the continent. Songwe also cites the Brookings Institution estimates that mobile technologies and services in Africa have generated more than $150 billion in economic value as of 2015, while the mobile ecosystem has supported 3 million jobs and contributed almost 14 billion in tax revenues in 2017. In infrastructure, new solar, wind, and geothermal technologies on and off-grid are helping break the electricity access bottleneck in Africa, helping households and businesses become more productive. As an example, 3 solar power companies in East and West Africa, Copa, Solar Sisters, and Lumos, which I also co-chair the board, have reached collectively more than 4 million people and are hoping to double that number within the next few years. The examples I've cited here are just a few ways that technology is making and will make a difference to the eradication of absolute poverty in Africa. I could go into more detail, but you've been long suffering. On the promise of biometrics and digital identities, which have made such an impact on access to services for the excluded in India, and promise to do the same in Africa. Don't get me wrong, I'm not being Pollyannish. I know some people will say I'm getting carried away. After all, though mobile phone ownership is high, internet penetration is still low, averaging 20% on the continent. But guess what? Internet penetration among the young is double that, 40%. This means that those who will form tomorrow's workforce and tomorrow's policymakers will be digitally connected and therefore better placed to use technology to change the face of poverty. This is another avenue in which I believe Africa can and will surprise. Ladies and gentlemen, friends, I earlier said that Africa has the seeds to eradicate poverty. The conduct of good macroeconomic policy and management, the effective use of appropriate microeconomic policies, and the ability to reform and transform certain sectoral sources of growth, the so-called smokestackless industries, among others, offers a clear pathway. When combined with the promise of technology to transform service delivery whilst creating jobs, this offers Africa that opportunity to surprise the world. Our job as development experts and partners is to support Africans with the knowledge and encouragement, and where possible, the resources to deliver. Friends, Africa has planted the seeds for poverty eradication. Policymakers must water the garden, and our young people must nurture the plants and flowers and harvest the fruit, because it is on this that their future depends. Let me conclude by quoting Nelson Mandela, who once said, like slavery and apartheid, poverty is not natural. It is man-made, and it can be overcome and eradicated by the action of human beings. Overcoming poverty is not a gesture of charity. It is the protection of a fundamental human right, the right to dignity and a decent life. I strongly subscribe to Madiba's words, and I know so do all of you. Let us all then join hands to ensure that Africa surprises. Thank you.
Thank you. So we have a bit of time now for questions. There are 4 microphones. One is here, one is there, another here, and the last here. And I know from the flurry of emails that have been bombarding my inbox since your lecture was announced that there's huge demand from the students to ask questions. So I won't abuse my position as chair. I'll start at the top with a question here. And if I can just ask you to please introduce yourself by name and then also ensure that your question is as efficient and curious as possible. So there will be no speeches tonight from the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Harvard Kennedy School of Governance, for giving me the opportunity to ask my question. Your Excellency, statisticians and romantic economists say Africa is growing. Some say Africa is growing at 4%, others say 6%. But the truth is Africa is stagnated. Africa is suffering from schizophrenia. My question to you is the root cause of the problem in Africa is corruption, and according to a report by Transparency International, every year about $1.5 billion is leaving Africa as illicit funds, and this is enough money that could rebuild Africa. So what is Africa doing to address the issue of corruption and to move the continent forward?
And your name, please?
My name is Chiro Njinya.
Thank you. Do you want to take them one at a time, or should we
No,
take
maybe
2?
we should take 3 at a time.
Okay, great. The next question is here.
My name is Jacob Marodian. I'm a third year at the law school and a Nigerian. And because we've mentioned that Nigeria is one of the key countries to alleviate this problem, I want to focus on Nigeria. So looking at the constitution and macroeconomic policy, do you think that the constitution as it currently stands with its exclusive lists and federating units and urban governance structures, can we alleviate poverty to the extent that we need to with the current constitution as it's structured? And if not, or if so, what improvements would you propose? Thank you.
And let's take one more question from this queue.
Hi, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala. Thank you so much for being here. You're actually one of my biggest inspirations. I'm an aspiring economist. So I'm a research scholar in economics. My name is Anna. And I have a question about sort of the role of neocolonialism and colonialism in sort of generating human capital on the continent. What is your view on that, and how much of a role do you think that's actually playing in sort of what we're seeing today? Thank you.
Great.
Well, thank you very much for very good questions. So the first question was that Africa has stagnated, there's corruption, and there's schizophrenia. Some people say it's growing, it's not growing. Of course, you know, you can always call it the glass half full, half empty syndrome. But we don't have to guess. The statistics are there, objectively produced, at least like the rest of the world, by either the United Nations, the World Bank, the IMF. You can look at these statistics and you can look at when have countries grown, when has the continent grown, when has it stagnated. It's very clear that from the 1.5 decades, like I quoted, from 2000 to 2015, it grew. It performed well compared to remember the lost decades of the 80s and 90s? When the continent was not growing, but in fact was per capita GDP growth was actually negative at some times. And recently, of course, the growth rate has declined. So there have been periods of growth, and there have been periods of stagnation, and there have been periods just like any other economy. I think the issue that I was trying to point out is there was a time when the continent was called the hopeless continent. You all know the Economist's hopeless continent and the promise, or whatever those titles were. So the issue is, when we performed well, why did we? Because sometimes people don't even know how to build on their own success. So we never ask, we always focus on what went wrong. But I'm interested in what went right. And how can we make it go even more right? So I'm not saying that what went right was sufficient, but how can we build on this? So that's the first point. Your second point is on corruption, and yes, it is true that there's corruption on the continent. In fact, I've just written a book about it. Can I have a copy? I wasn't going to say anything about it, but please, you know, I didn't bring any. You can go and buy one for yourselves. It's MIT. It's MIT Press, so it's a public policy book. It's not it's meant to teach. And it's been doing extremely well. So you can... They are using it in Georgetown in one of their classes to teach. So it's called Fighting Corruption is Dangerous. The story behind the headlines. Of course, there's corruption on the continent, so I'm not trying to get away from that. But I don't like the word. Whenever you mention Africa, the next word is corruption. Or you mention Nigeria, the next word is corruption. No. We cannot allow our continent or our countries to be characterized in that way. Because I'll tell you what. My thesis is that one of the most fundamental causes of corruption on the continent is the weakness of institutions. And I know it's very sexy to say when there's corruption, arrest them, grab them, punish them. You are attacking the symptom, but not the root cause. And one of the reasons when this realization came to me, one of the reasons I agreed to be finance minister in my country the second time was because I realized that the institutions were so weak and people were trying to block even the few we were attempting to build. Please give me a moment. I'm going to take a little bit of time on this issue because it provoked me. I wasn't going to talk about my book or about corruption. I wasn't, but now I have to say something. So the absence of institutions. When I went to become finance minister in Nigeria the first time, in 2003 to 2006, I didn't really know much about running the economy of because in the World Bank, you're not allowed to work on your own country in those days. So when I was asked to be finance, I was deploying all my knowledge. But I found out that as finance minister, when I needed to pay salaries, I had to transfer money, cash, to the Ministry of Agriculture, for instance. They would give me a list at the end of the month and say, these are the number of people employed in the Ministry of Agriculture this month. So this is the amount finance has to pay. And we would transfer the resources to them. Guess what is wrong with that? Guess what? People can introduce names every month. And they did. So we got the phenomenon of ghost workers who became ghost pensioners. And I said to President Obasanjo at the time, we don't even have an electronic platform or a financial management system embedded in an IT platform for the country to work, a large country like Nigeria. And then I said, we need to do something. So with his backing and permission with the economic team, we were able to then get the World Bank, DFID, USAID. We went into a project to build this platform. But it takes a long time. We started, and when I left in 2006, it was not finished. And people were fighting all the way. So in 2011, when I was called, when I realized that this project had basically been stopped after I left, I decided it's one of the reasons I went back. Because those people would not want me to come back. So they could keep blocking and putting ghost workers. So we went back, and by the time I left the second time, we had 75% completed it. Go and read the IMF Article 4 report. We had put in place that platform. We had weeded out 64,000 ghost workers. We had saved $1.1 billion for the government. So that is just one example of building an electronic a financial management platform and a treasury single account. So that's what it is. Africans are no more corrupt than Americans or Europeans. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to say anything. I'm just trying to say that if you did not have the same institutions here, the same things would happen. And we can see that institutions can also be undermined, can't we? We are seeing it here every day. So be careful. Institutions matter. So that's my issue about corruption. And when you go, one of the things I said is, you're sitting there. Please, when you finish, what country are you from?
Originally, I'm from Cameroon.
You must go back to Cameroon and help to fight it. You cannot sit here. That's what I did. I was at the World Bank enjoying myself. And I was invited to come back, very risky. And I took one of the biggest risks in my life to go back. Because you know what? When you fight corruption, those same people fight you back. And if they can't fight you, they smear you. So they spent all the time trying to characterize me. That's why I wrote this book, to tell the truth. They kidnapped my mother and held her for 5 days and said I should resign. And I refused. My father was backing me. They threatened me. And even after I left, they continued to malign my name. That's why I wrote, fighting corruption is dangerous. But who will fight for you, you Africans in the room? I took a risk. Because even people, there are people, sensible people, who still believe Okonjo-Iweala did something. Just because those people tried to damage your name. If I had not had an international career before and people had not known me, by now people will think I'm also part and parcel of the business. So, but in spite of all that, I don't regret one day. I went and I fought. And so when my grandchildren ask me, I'll be able to lift up my head and say, yes, I did something. What are you going to say? And I'm not attacking you. I just want you to go back to Cameroon. The second question is on poverty alleviation. With the current Nigerian construct, you mentioned constitution, but construct is in the constitution. Nigeria is a very decentralized country with 36 states, 774 local governments, and a federal government. And the constitution gives enormous room to the states to, conduct their affairs. And I think in that kind of construct, it's not really possible for the federal government alone to fight poverty. You're absolutely right. I think it has to be an endeavor that the states fully participate in. But I think the problem we have is holding states and state governors accountable in Nigeria is not a very easy thing. The federal government has an overwhelming presence, and people tend to focus on the federal government all the time. So if we are to have effective poverty eradication, we must pay attention to the states. We must support the state governors, but we must also hold them accountable to do the right things. 2, we must support communities. Nigerians have one thing in common. They are very active community-wise, but we are losing that. How do we get agency out of the people themselves so that they can do more? So that's my question to you, my answer to you. And then the third was on the role of neocolonialism and in human capital, was it? Yeah. Look, I mean, there's absolutely no way we can get away with not recognizing that colonialism and neocolonialism have a role to play in what has happened and is happening in Africa today. So I often joke, whenever I make a speech somewhere, I make sure there are no British people in the room. How many Brits are here? None?
They won't say no. Because
I sometimes hold them responsible for, some of the things we see in my country. But look, yes, we got a system of education in many of our countries that is not flexible, not attuned to what we need, does not change with the times. And if we don't change our education system to deliver the skills, because we don't know what jobs are around the corner, if we can't deliver analytical skills needed to move people from job to job, we will fall further behind. That's why I mentioned skills in my speech. But I think we can. It's in our hands. So much as I subscribe, I also now do not think we should look back to that all the time. We have to look to the future. We've had 50 years, 60 years to change some of these practices and some of what we found. Did we do it? We compounded it. Whatever it is that they put there, instead of changing it, we built on it and made it worse. In many cases. The education system is geared towards white-collar jobs. Everybody, including me, all parents want their children to be doctors, engineers, lawyers. You come to Africa, there's a missing middle. Nobody wants to be a plumber, a painter, an electrician. So we have to change some of that and build the kinds of skills we need for the future. So colonialism, yes, they gave us a platform that wasn't quite suited to what we needed. But we had some platform. It was up to us to change that platform and keep changing it to deliver what we want for the future. So we have to own up to that. Okay.
All right, we have time for one last question, which is difficult, but I'm going to actually take it from this side because it's the longest queue.
Oh, good evening, Dr. Okonjo-Iweala. Thank you for coming here and speaking with us all today. My name is Chinaza Asiabu, and I'm a student at Harvard College. I want to ask, the growth in Africa is constantly shown to be stagnant, and the perception of the Western world and those who say they fight for poverty seem to look at Africa as a child who will never grow up. And I wanted to know, how do we address the factors that you mentioned, such as corruption and gender inequality and others, while maintaining that Africa has the capacity to do it ourselves? How can we preserve the dignity of the African people in fighting this problem of poverty instead of using humanitarian aid to throw money at the problem, and instead building institutions that will fight it long term, as you talked about?
Mm-hmm. Okay, is that the last question? Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, this encapsulates most of what I was trying to say in my lecture. First of all, I don't agree with you that Africa is stagnant. You know, I'm an economist. I just look at the numbers. It's been stagnant sometimes, it's grown sometimes. You know, it will happen. And it's not the only continent that does that. I mean, China was growing at double-digit growth rates, and it's decelerating now for reasons of structural change and transformation of its economy in another direction. So we shouldn't buy into that. You know, but we shouldn't be Pollyannish. I mean, we shouldn't also go think everything is great. It's not. And I made that abundantly clear by dwelling on all the causes of poverty, because unless we accept, we are not going to be able to change those. So I think Africa is not a child that will never grow up. The analogy is very interesting. It's growing and can do better. That's my thesis. But we need to solve that problem, and we need to realize that we have to do it ourselves. With respect to aid, the world has changed. There's so much uncertainty. And the idea that you're going to attain the Sustainable Development Goals by relying on aid is just not feasible. That's why I mentioned the fact that we'll have to rely on our own resources. And we've got the capacity to do it. So what do we need? We need movement from the bottom, and we also need movement from the top. So I said policymakers, we have the seeds, and policymakers have to water the garden. So we have to elect and select those policymakers who will do the right thing. And we already have examples on the continent. It's not as if there's nothing good. There are some countries growing at almost double digits. Ethiopia has been growing at double digits. And maybe now it's around 8%. Its Prime Minister just got the Nobel Prize. I cited 8 countries. So we've got an example in our neighborhood. The question we should ask is, what are those countries doing right? I'm not saying they're doing everything right, but they're doing very many things right. Can we replicate? So the answer to your question is yes, we can. We need to study those countries. We need to do what they're doing. We need to do even better, and 3 countries matter terribly. If Nigeria, South Africa, and Angola don't do well, we will not change the continent statistics as much as we want, and DRC. So we need to elect good leaders. We need to hold them accountable to deliver growth. And we ourselves need to be actors. I also don't believe in just looking at others and saying, somebody must do something. I start by asking myself, what can I do? Even if you change the life of one person through an NGO, private sector, whatever, you've done something. So we as Africans must act. We must use our own capacity. Use your education here from Harvard to go back. We must elect good leaders. You're young. If you don't vote, you won't get the good leaders that you need. And if you don't vote wisely, you won't get them. And 2, we must push for a different kind of education on the continent, because the future is changing rapidly. And if we don't understand that, we won't be able to surprise. But the point is, I believe we do. We are beginning to understand, and we can grasp this opportunity that is before us and do it. Thank you.
Dr. Okonjo-Iweala, thank you so much for your remarks. I was taking copious notes because I think a lot of what you said applies globally, not just in Africa. I know that we have questions on the floor. I'm sorry that we couldn't reach everyone. I hope that you'll come back and fill us in on all the topics we didn't get to address. But would everyone please join me in thanking Dr. Okonjo-Iweala one more time.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.